The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well and that it's as nice as sunny where you are as it is where I am. This is the DBHR Supervisor Learning Community call, and we're going to wait a couple more minutes to allow some other attendees to log on. But I just wanted to say welcome and hang on for a couple of minutes. We'll be right with you. All right, I see other people still logging on. I'll say once again, welcome this afternoon to the IPS Supervisor Learning Collaborative. Our intent is to be informal, is to have conversations as much as possible, and to just learn from each other and learn from Paul and develop a collaborative so that we have people we can talk to in between times when we have questions or concerns. This is the webinar is hosted by the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery. Paul Phares is from the Public Consulting Group and will be on in just a moment. I wanted to welcome everyone here and let you know that it's being recorded and that we will send out the recording later on to all of the individuals who registered. So if for some reason you have to leave early, like has happened on occasion, or for people who had signed up but aren't able to attend today, we will make sure to send out the recording and the slides afterwards. So Paul, if you would like to get started, I think probably we're ready to go.
All right, Dawn, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, on this lovely Monday afternoon. Let me see if I can get the PowerPoint slides to cooperate. Today we're going to talk about collaboration between IPS agencies and the Division of Vocational Rehab or Rehab Services. This is, IPS is a unique evidence-based practice in that it requires, via a Fidelity Scale, collaboration with external entities. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how agencies, IPS agencies with high fidelity scores have figured out ways to collaborate very effectively with their DVR counterparts. So our agenda is very simple, and so I'll have some slides that we'll go through, and then I'll turn it out to you all for discussion and questions. And questions don't have to only be about our slide content, just so you all know. I'm willing to talk about whatever kind of challenges you might be having regarding implementing IPS in your agency. So we're going to talk about common themes, how IPS and Division of Vocational Rehabilitation are actually more similar than they are dissimilar. We'll talk about challenges of collaboration, kind of that, I call it growing pains, but when the relationship is forming between IPS and DVR, where the common areas are that we struggle to understand each other. And then I'll also share with you some of the strategies, kind of the playbook where places have figured it out. I'll share with you what we've seen across the nation. So I always like to give some context when Dawn asks me to talk with a group of folks in Washington. Most of what I'll talk about today is not Washington specific. So if you do have specific questions regarding Washington and IPS and its implementation in Washington, that's okay. Just know that Paul might not be able to answer those and might not be the best person to answer those, but you can still ask those questions and we can still try to get you answers. I'll talk mostly about best practices or common approaches, and when I give you an example of an agency that has done A, B, or C, you can pretty much bet that those agencies have had full implementation of IPS. They've been shown to have good outcomes, high fidelity programs. And some of what I'm talking about is really driven by the IPS Fidelity Scale. And if you're not familiar with that or don't have a level of comfort with it, I encourage you to visit IPS Works website where you can get it for free and really learn to understand it. So I'll start here with kind of the core principles of IPS. And if you're an IPS provider agency right now, these should be familiar to you for sure. If you're not familiar with these, the idea is, like most employers have mission statements or value statements, these really are the values or the principles behind IPS and the IPS model of supported employment. And they're fairly simple. Zero exclusion is what it sounds like. Well, they're all what they sound like. Rapid job search, integrating mental health and employment teams, competitive employment or the search for competitive employment, time unlimited support, attention to customer preferences, continuous assessment, and benefits counseling. And so I thought it best to start here just to try to level set because I know what's on the next slide, which is what Dawn and some of her colleagues kind of helped me create during one of our presentations, is this crosswalk between IPS principles and practices on the left side, and then vocational rehabilitation principles and practices. And really, we have a couple of 3 slides here just to show you how much IPS and vocational rehab have in common. So just starting at the very beginning, number one, competitive employment is the same on both sides. When you're thinking about collaboration, I always think about what I call the safe space, and that is the place where we both can agree.
I'm sorry, Paul. Did you advance a slide? Because on my screen it did not.
I did. It's not showing it. Let me go look at the menu and see what.
Bummer. Told you I shouldn't have said anything about how well this platform's been going.
So what do you see right now, Dawn? What do you have
core
on your screen?
The slide that you had just done, the core principles.
That's interesting. I wonder. It's on my screen.
Does anyone else see? And maybe it's just, oh, there we go. Now we've got it.
Okay. So that's interesting. I went back one slide and then, thank you for pointing it out. I went back one slide and then I advanced it again. So please, if that happens again, let me know. And maybe I have to advance the same slide twice. I don't know. Who knows? Thank you, Dawn. So starting at number 1, left side is IPS practices or principles, and the right side would be vocational rehab principles or practices. Starting right out of the gates, competitive employment is a value, something that is important to both entities. And this is what I was talking about, is this is that shared space where 2 entities can kind of come together and agree that, yes, this is important to us. So competitive employment, number 1 with a bullet, for sure. In IPS, you see number 2 here, IPS services being integrated with mental health treatment services. And the reason behind that is because we know from research that IPS that stands alone, completely separate from any other supportive services, is not as good as when it's integrated into those services. And in the same way, number 2 for voc rehab is identifying needed service providers and supports. So again, common theme here between IPS agencies and values in voc rehab. Number 3, with IPS, eligibility is based on choice, and with voc rehab, eligibility must be documented. And I think a common theme between both IPS providers and vocational rehab entities you will find is that knowing something is good, but documenting that something is even better. And whether that's medical necessity or determinations of need, all of that eligibility is great, but it's only as good as how well it's documented. Did the slide advance, Dawn?
Not yet.
Check my screen. So, not yet?
Oh, yep, it did. It did.
All right, how about, okay, good. So there must be a delay. Good to know. So going forward with this crosswalk, number 4, IPS values honoring individual preferences, and really the short version of that is if a customer comes in and says they'd really like to work in a restaurant, we would expect to see that the job search contains restaurant-type employers, unless there's additional documentation that would lead us to believe otherwise. In the same way, vocational rehab, definitely has comprehensive assessment of strengths, comprehensive assessment of resources. And so again, strengths and preferences, well, they're not exactly the same thing. A lot of what I have seen is that customers tend to prefer the things they're strongest with. I think there's commonality between those two as well. The rapid job search portion of IPS is very consistent with the timely plan for employment that VR wants. These are things that can help each other, can enhance each other's services. Number 6, IPS specialist builds relationships with employers. It's the very same as the VR counselor assisting the IPS team with employer relationships. Everybody has strengths. Everybody's a part of the team. And the idea is we're working together so that we can get somebody employed in the community. Advancing the slide here, so you should see number 7 now at the top of your screen.
It works.
There it is. On the IPS side of things, individualized job support for as long as necessary. This is very consistent with how VR counselors arrange for extended services. And the VR counselor could arrange for extended services by working with an IPS agency for their shared customer. That makes a lot of sense. And then certainly personalized benefits counseling is provided. Vocational rehabilitation, same exact wording basically. We all want to account for how someone's employment income might change their other benefit income, and you do that with benefits counseling for sure. So now knowing kind of how they're common, these common goals really come to the top, don't they? Employment, I think, is the one that sticks out to me. Everybody at the table, including the customer, is wanting to get a successful employment outcome. Dawn has heard me speak enough to tell you that I think, especially if you're a mental health provider, you can't be talking about recovery if you're not talking about employment. Employment, or the role associated with employment, is one of the first things. It's one of the first topics in conversation when you meet a new person. I always like to say by the third question, you end up asking somebody, what do you do for a living? And that's because of the value our society places on employment and what we get out of it. So if we really want recovery, we really need to be thinking about employment for the folks we serve. Other common goals, I think, between VR and IPS agencies include an increase in independence for the folks we serve, and a decrease in dependence on entitlements. This might not always be overt, and we might not lead with this, but I think what we see time and time again is as customers become employed and get value from employment, they tend to be more willing and interested in decreasing their level of entitlements. And maybe not coming off of entitlements entirely, some do for sure, but whereas you might have had someone who was very afraid of losing any benefit income, once they become employed in the community and understand how that works for them, it is very common to see them be okay with replacing benefit income with employment income. Other things that I might want to make sure that I note, there was some research done by my friend Gene Olvey and several other folks back in 2013 where they took a deep dive into the study of kind of the vocational rehabilitation culture. And they had, and their willingness and expertise, I guess I should say, to be a part of the IPS process. And the 4 bullet points from that research article that I really like are these here, that VR has a corporate culture that values work first. And the assumption is anyone that walks in the door is capable of employment. And I think that is a testament to the movement away from readiness for employment and the movement towards employment first. And it's a really interesting conclusion. Most of these folks are either affiliated with IPS or affiliated with VR, either at the state or national level, who did this research project. The second bullet point is VR staff have job placement, job development skills, and networks, and that is absolutely true. VR staff have expertise and ongoing training in multidisability work accommodations, and that is a very, very important thing for IPS agencies to leverage with their local VR office. And then VR staff have access to an array of resources, and that certainly includes maybe some financial resources that your average IPS agency might not have access to, whether it be money for work uniform, money for work boots, that sort of thing, but also resources sometimes at the state or federal level that your average IPS agency just doesn't have access to. So again, it's very conducive to collaboration right out of the gate. Now that I've said all the positive stuff, I should tell you about the challenges, right? So the challenges may be exactly what you think they are. They may be news to you, but let's go through them. Some of the more common points of contention include the concept, the principle of no exclusion. So for an IPS agency, no exclusion means supported employment services are available to everybody they serve, period. And that is easy to say and difficult to do. There are a lot of ways you can be excluding people formally or informally with no negative intentions, just because of the way you have programs set up or departments set up. So it's already a challenge just for the IPS provider. It's also a challenge for VR from time to time. For example, if VR refers a customer to an IPS agency for help with finding employment in the community, you may find any one of these two bullet points could be a problem. Perhaps they don't have the insurance coverage that would allow the IPS team to fully work with them. So that's something to consider. That's technically a problem with no exclusion. But more common than insurance coverage, I find with agencies when there is a problem with no exclusion, it surrounds what I call diagnostic categories. And so, for example, a lot of IPS agencies are also mental health centers. And so if they are unable to make a medically necessary diagnosis formulation, they may say we are unable to serve this person who's interested in employment. And I'm not here to tell you that's right or wrong, as much as I am to say, as a Fidelity reviewer, you come in and you see that and you think there's someone who's interested in employment services and cannot get them. So there can be a little rub when VR and IPS agencies are starting to work together based on how customers are referred back and forth, potential insurance coverages, and then certainly diagnostic categories. And this is a small list. There are a lot of other things you could lump in here. Readiness is another one. I probably should have put readiness first, to be very honest with you. Readiness typically has some of the most robust discussions between IPS agencies and VR staff. And it's not that anybody's right or wrong, or that I'm here to tell you definitively there is this answer and that's the only answer. Some of these, some of the nuance surrounding any given customer that comes to any of our agencies, some of the nuance there really has to be talked through. And so I want to just really encourage you all, if you remember one thing from today, it's that as long as you're talking with each other, you're moving in the right direction. There are going to be times where you disagree with each other, and that's okay. But you have to remember that you have a customer to serve too. So you have to figure it out from that perspective. So in readiness, substance abuse, an IPS agency might be working with a customer who is drinking and doing drugs currently, and simultaneously looking for employment. And sometimes VR is not as open to that employment search as the IPS agency, and that's okay. I think there's valid points when a VR counselor says, I worry that they won't be able to hold a job because they're intoxicated every day, for example, or I'm worried they won't pass a drug screen. Those are very valid points. And as I said earlier, it's important to keep talking them through, because you certainly won't get to a conclusion without talking them through. But IPS is a little different than traditional supported employment, because it operates under the premise that even if they're using drugs, even if they're drinking, we should still continue searching for employment with them. And we should educate them on how they might not get a job if they show up to the interview intoxicated. And sometimes that's the best learning experience. And research shows that there is no difference in employment outcomes between people with substance use history and people without. So that would tell me we need to really talk it through on an individual basis rather than on these global scales, like painting with a broad brush, like people who are using drugs are not ready to look for employment until they're sober. So that's just worth really mentioning and going into a little detail on. Another place where readiness has really come into play in conversations with VR and IPS agencies is the history of a customer's follow-through. And I will be the first to tell you that the best predictor of the future is the history. However, again, the premise that IPS supported employment really is operating under just kind of identifies that, yes, that's part of what got them here to me today, but I'm part of the reason that today might be different. And so it's important just to kind of check some of that narrative at the door and have it inform your conversation, but not necessarily your decision, if that makes sense. Other points of contention, and I'm going to go back. I don't think the slide advanced, but we're going to try it again. All right, other points of contention include rapid search for employment. And often what we will see is for our great staff members, for our great VR counselors, for our great IPS agencies and their employees, often they can get started working with people way faster than our paperwork moves. And again, it's not right or wrong, but often there are multiple levels where the paperwork has to go to get a sign off or request for records or so on and so forth. And so sometimes those two kind of boots on the ground and paperwork systems, they just move at different speeds. And it's important to talk that through. It's important to know each other's deadlines and know how quickly things are moving, not to delay the process, but to just be informed of the process. And so you're talking about two separate systems of paperwork, and both probably move at various speeds, is worth saying. It's fair to say. Again, readiness, I think, bubbles up in the rapid search for employment, depending on a customer's presentation. There may be a disagreement about whether or not they're, serious about their search for employment or whether or not they're ready to search for employment. But I got to tell you, from the IPS perspective, if they're showing up to look for employment, barring acute intoxication, the employment search can continue. Again, with all of the education that comes with it, that, hey, you look like you've been up all night doing drugs, and if we had an interview scheduled for you today, I really would worry that you wouldn't put the best foot forward. And those are things we have to say to our customers, and those are things we have to, acknowledge to each other too. Another point of contention is IPS sees VR really being included as team members for the IPS team. And there are specific Fidelity Scale items that gauge and evaluate the relationship between the IPS agency and the VR liaison. And sometimes VR doesn't feel comfortable, saying things because they don't want to damage somebody's score. And it's not really like that. It's important to understand that you're a resource. VR is a resource for the IPS agencies, just like they're a resource for you. And I think it's fair to say, too, that Fidelity reviewers understand that there is a continuum of the relationship. And sometimes relationships are great and it's effortless and you don't have to really do anything or work too hard to make it work because it just works. Other times you can have turnover that impacts your relationship, and it's no one's fault, but you just try to get back, to where your wheels have some traction. And so reviewers understand all of that, but it is important to be a part of the team in the way that you can be a part of the team and in the way that the Fidelity Scale allows you to. So here's the good news. If you're on this call, you're already trained to handle all these things. You think about some of the high-level themes we've talked about already. You all are in health and human services. You know how to have relationships. You know how to manage relationships, both with customers, with coworkers, with stakeholders in the community. Those are things you're already good at. You're good at being client-focused. Every single one of us on this call has some form of a treatment plan or a plan for care or a plan for employment. We all want the best for the person coming in asking for help, and we all want to help them. And so really, again, that shared space, that safe space, That's where we can all get together, is what's best for the client. Let's forget for a minute about some of these rules. Let's talk about, Bob. Bob came in and he wants our help. How can we help him? You're all good at team discussions. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, has some sort of staffing or staff meeting or space that their employer has created wherein you get to talk about the work you're doing. You get to talk about the challenges you're having with particular customers, the challenges you're having with particular systems of care, and then you try to group problem solve some of that. And then also, good news, you're all adept at how to identify areas of conflict and ways that you can address them. And that's just interacting with humans is how you get good at that. So the research is clear. And again, my friend Gene Olvey has this other article in March of 2013 where he talks about exactly how it's kind of a playbook for how VR and IPS practitioners can get along. Not to imply that they ever didn't get along, but how you can kind of work best and most effectively together. And it's really whittled down to 4 things here, and it makes a lot of sense. Number 1, enhance mutual knowledge and understanding between VR and IPS practitioners. Now, I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but I want to make sure you all hear me say it. I don't expect that VR learns and knows everything under the sun about their IPS agency. There's not enough room in anybody's brain or life for that. But you need to know what you need to know, if that makes any sense. And the same goes for IPS practitioners. They should become familiar with VR rules. They should understand what their VR liaison has to do when they send a referral to VR. They should know what that means. It helps us work together better. Number 2, examine and modify VR regulations and guidelines that conflict with IPS principles. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, not all of us on this call even have the ability to do that. However, each state interprets federal rules in their own way. So there's some inconsistencies at the state level between states, both in VR and IPS. I would bet that within states, there's differences of interpretation and differences of priority between different VR offices across any given state. In the same way, different IPS providers in any given state, even though there's a Fidelity Scale, implement that Fidelity in subtle different ways. And so that's important to know what the regulations and guidelines say, both for VR and IPS, but also to understand how we're both working towards those regulations and guidelines. It gives us a better understanding of how to work together and what each other's priorities are. Number 3 is create clear guidelines for VR participation on IPS teams. And really, the guidelines there they lie within the IPS Fidelity Scale. And we'll get to that in a minute as well. And then number 4, create guidelines for good relationships between VR and community mental health centers. As I said earlier, a lot of IPS agencies are community mental health centers. You might not all be, for those who are on the phone as IPS providers, and that's okay. IPS has been shown to be applicable to a wide variety of different diagnostic categories and populations. So don't sweat that if you're not a community mental health center. It's not mandatory by any means. So I'm having trouble getting my screen to change here. So I'm going to talk a little bit while I'm trying to get it to work. So I'm going to move into collaboration strategies. So the good news is, if you're on this call and you're wondering, how do I start a relationship with my local VR office? If you're on the call and you're with VR and you're wondering, I don't even work with IPS agencies, will they reach out to me? How does this all work? There is a playbook, and I'm going to go through it here. As soon as I can get the slide to change, I'm going to go through it with you all. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to hope this system catches up to me, okay? The first thing, we talked about enhancing mutual knowledge. Some of this is very, I think, commonsensical, and if you can do it or at the the pace that is appropriate for you to get it done, it is really best practice. So first, if you're in VR, it is very helpful to ask any given IPS agency for a brief orientation to their agency. Understand how they do the work they do, understand other resources they have in place to support the employment services, and then definitely you're going to want to look through their eligibility criteria, understand their strengths, and then really understand their limitations. And the best example I like to give here is there's no shortage of good ideas, and any IPS agency has a whole host of ideas of things they want to do or could do. Often, there's not funding available in this human services world we find ourselves in to do all the things we want to do. So it's good for you to know what they can and can't do so that you're not, there, the slide just clicked over, I think. It's good for you to know what they can and can't do so that you're not referring to an IPS agency for a lot of services that they just are unable to provide. The flip side to this is true as well. If you're working at the VR office or you're at the IPS agency, get oriented to the VR office. Understand their scope, understand their geographical region that they serve, understanding sort of specialized resources, specialized programs that they have available under their roof. Also understand some of those things that are what I call add-on or value added. So, what do you need to do in order to signal to your VR office, for example, that somebody needs a uniform for work and does not have the money to pay for it? And is that a reimbursement? Does that mean the IPS agency has to go pay for it and submit it for reimbursement, or are you able to get a check or VR to go pay for it with some sort of magical credit card or something like that? Those are all things that are worth figuring out on the front end and help your relationship in the long run. Still under enhancing mutual knowledge, know and understand the principles of IPS. This definitely is for IPS agencies. Also for VR, you don't have to have, if you're at VR, you don't have to know all of the rules. But if you can know enough about the IPS rules, for example, to work with your IPS agencies on clarity for zero exclusion. How do they interpret zero exclusion? How do they think they meet it? Rapid job search, placement. Those are things that you can really help narrow the scope on with IPS agencies. And you can share, if you're an IPS agency, you can share that with your local VR office just as a way to fully inform the conversation. Often, I shouldn't say often, sometimes we'll see some sort of non-ideal relationship with an IPS agency and a VR office. And when you talk with both parties, what you end up hearing is essentially over time, one was referring kind of the wrong kind of customer to the other, and nobody fully educated each other on why it was the wrong kind of referral or why it could have been a better referral or how it could have been a better referral. And so over time, they just kind of stopped referring, or maybe, just thought it was something personal as opposed to just, a rule that they had to follow. And so, again, your best defense against any of this relationship sort of problem is open lines of communication. The flip side is also true. Help provider agencies, IPS agencies, understand VR rules. Help them understand, hey, your referral is great, but here's what I have to do with it after it gets to me. There's 3 other steps, and it's important for you to know that. That way you're not burning up my phone line saying, did you get it done? Did you get it done? Did you get it done? There's more than just me that has to touch it. And so it's important for folks to know how that all process-wise kind of moves so that they know, I just need to wait, I just need to wait a couple of days for this person's signature or whatever. And that goes for eligibility, paperwork, and then expectations. There's a lot of VR liaisons that in a Fidelity review will tell you, I feel bad because I deny a lot of the referrals because they don't meet necessity, but they don't send me the right paperwork. I feel like they don't send me the right paperwork when I request it. As an IPS agency, it's to your advantage to get all the paperwork you can get that will help the VR liaison arrive at a determination. And it's probably easier for you to get as an IPS agency than it is for VR to go through the paperwork process to request a document. Another thing that was mentioned in that research was examining and modifying VR regulations. So really, again, not everybody has the ability to change VR regulations at the federal level or even the state level. But it's important that to know the collaboration between mental health and VR, that alone doesn't support every single component of IPS. And that's not good or bad, but there are certain things that only IPS agencies can do and certain things that only VR agencies can do, and that's okay. It's important to know, too, that leadership influences changes both in the mental health world and the vocational rehabilitation world. That's often when you see leadership changes, that's when you start to see some of the regulations get reviewed or changed or modified. So it's important when there is a change in leadership, let's say state level leadership, check in with your local office about anything they're hearing about changes in regulations that might impact the IPS customers. That's okay to ask, and it's okay to have an open discussion on it. And it's even more important if there is a change in regulation that you get in front of it and kind of alert people to changes that might impact their job. And I'll give you an example from Illinois, which is where I live. Illinois recently went to a statewide mental health assessment. So every community mental health provider in the state of Illinois uses the same exact assessment form now. That started January 1st, 2019. So when we started getting training on this back in 2018, we started looping in our vocational rehabilitation office on the changes and showing them the document and talking to them about how, hey, listen, formerly we would submit to you our version of the mental health assessment, and this is where you would find medical necessity, and this is where you would find, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have this new form that we have to complete by state law, and we want to talk with you about how can we complete it in a way that helps you identify medical necessity for services. And that open discussion on the front end really led to not even a speed bump once January 2019 hit. Now, of course, there's still a little variation between what one clinician does versus another, and that's okay because we can work on that. But getting in front of some of those changes, once you hear about them, once you learn about them, can really help to be inclusive. And then I always tell folks too, remember, some rules, some regulations are open to interpretation. They are not 100% crystal clear, and you may find variation between employee A, employee B, and employee C's interpretation of it. And again, rather than get frustrated about inconsistencies, talk it through. Get clinician A, B, and C together. Talk about, how can we can't have three different answers. We need to have an answer and talk it through. It might take a while. It's a process, but have open lines of communication that can really help get in front of a lot of problems. We have some Fidelity Scale items that really help us create clear guidelines for VR participation on IPS teams and create guidelines for good relationships between VR and community mental health centers. So, for example, in the IPS Fidelity Scale, it says for the highest number of points available, it says you're meeting with folks weekly, face-to-face, to talk about clients, customers. So that's pretty clear. That's a clear guideline for the highest points possible. And those are all reflective of a good relationship as well. Those result in, I should say, a good relationship between VR and IPS providers. So it's important that you know the IPS Fidelity Scale if you're an IPS agency for sure. And it's important if you're an IPS agency to talk with your VR liaison about the Fidelity Scale language surrounding your relationship with VR. And so if it's difficult to get time to meet weekly, talk about what kind of what's allowable according to the Fidelity Scale and how can you get it, not just because you want to check it off the list on the Fidelity Scale, but because research shows if we get high fidelity scores, we will have good outcomes. And that's back to the shared space, the safe space that everybody can agree on. We want good outcomes for our customers. So instead of it just being an ask from one agency to another, often you can change the conversation to, we need to find a way to do this so that we can support good work, which gets good outcomes, which everybody wins doing that. So some examples of how other agencies have really satisfied this section of the rule include VR counselor meeting customers at the mental health agency VR counselor becoming a part of the treatment team, where they sit in and staffing. They have, equal participation on any sort of treatment team meeting. Conversely, employment team, some agencies have an employment team meeting customers at the VR office. And, really, it could go either way. It could be both. But these are just some examples. VR counselor and IPS specialist meeting with each person served each month. Again, some of these are best practices. Going forward into the creating guidelines for good relationships between voc rehab and IPS agencies. Understand the VR policies, the practice. We've talked about this a little bit. Understand the IPS team policies, the IPS practice, and share those with each other. Nobody wants to ask someone else to do something that they can't do. That just kind of sets it up in a bad way. So understand where people stop and start and what you can and can't do with regards to IPS support employment. And that's where you start the discussion. That IPS Fidelity Scale, it's important to view that as a bridge between the VR and the IPS agency world. As I've said a few times already, in general, higher fidelity equals better outcomes. And that's again, really what we're all here for, is to get good outcomes. And it is highly relationship driven. People need to be able to trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. And if you're a VR counselor, you want to refer somebody to an IPS agency that's going to help them get the job they want and keep it. So with that context, if you're an IPS agency, that's really where you start the discussion. If you don't have any relationship at all, you start the discussion with how can I help? And here's where I start and here's where I stop. Here's my limitations. And anything within that context is fair game. And just walk it through piece by piece, customer by customer. So to sum up, kind of a little bit of everything that we've talked about, certainly actively collaborate. High fidelity programs meet very regularly, either at the IPS agency, at DVR, sometimes off-site locations that are, kind of in the middle of where each agency is, sometimes by phone, sometimes with video. Nonetheless, there's an effect on fidelity for the IPS program, which is important to the IPS agency. There's an effect on employment outcomes, which is important to both, the IPS agency, VR, for sure, and then customers as well. They want, if they come for help getting employed, they want to get employed. And then your active collaboration or your level of collaboration has an effect on customers, whether you know it or not. When a customer gets referred to an IPS agency, if they don't get what they want, yet they keep getting referred back there, at some point, that could have an impact on their ability or their willingness or interest in seeking out employment. And we don't want that. We want them to continue to stay motivated for sure. It's also been shown that using a client-centered approach, really where we put the customer or the client in the center of our discussion, helps mitigate a lot of the disagreement. It helps us all focus on the client, and it really helps us establish what I call a shared decision-making process with treatment teams. It kind of cuts through any of that sort of expert mode that sometimes people want to get into, because it's not about me anymore, it's not about you anymore, it's about us, and it's about how we can help our customer. That's what we have in common, and sure, we have rules to follow, and we both want to follow them, but how can we make this work so we can help this person that came and asked us for help? Often the teams that keep all of that at the forefront of their discussion really move through some of this disagreement and some of the kind of worlds collide sort of approach to IPS and DVR. And the reality too is the worlds aren't really colliding, because IPS and DVR have a lot of the same common goals and tasks in mind. So it's a matter of speaking the same language often. And if you don't have a relationship, establishing one, which, as a reminder, it takes time. Don't expect to have it be easy and work every single time. You will disagree on things, and that's okay. We always like to say that you can disagree without being disagreeable, and just talk through the challenges you're having to get this particular thing done, or work with this particular customer. And having a real collaborative approach really gets you a long way towards solving some of the problems. So at that point, I am through my slides, and I am happy to turn it over to folks who might have questions. I'm going to pull up the chat window here, and just in case we got anybody who's wanting to send a chat question, we have that ability. Or Dawn, you'll have to help me. I'm not sure how to unmute people if everybody's muted.
Okay. Yeah, and I think we've tried doing it everybody in the past, and what ended up happening was a lot of feedback. So we kind of do it one person at a time. And it's that little red microphone. When you click on it, it should turn to green. So having said that, one of the other things that I wanted to talk about briefly was, since this is a supervisor's call, I would love to discuss how do supervisors make sure that all of this wonderful stuff that you were just talking about happens between the staff they supervise and DVR. And one of the thoughts that I have, there are a couple of different categories within the Fidelity Scale that talk about supervisor roles, one of which is to be the champion of services. So if there's been some kind of difficulty with collaborating with DVR, it might be the supervisor's role to meet with DVR staff along with perhaps their direct service staff, and just start those kinds of conversations to kind of move forward with how do we iron these things out if there's some issue. By the same token, maybe there's no issue, maybe there's just non-involvement, and it might come down to the supervisor actually talking with DVR and trying to promote relationships and referrals and that kind of thing. So that what my question would be, what does anybody else think as far as their role as a supervisor when it comes to DVR and kind of helping to make these things happen? What other thoughts do you have? And Paul, what about you as well? What other thoughts do you have related to that whole supervisor role and how it fits in with all of this?
I will tell you that agencies that have exemplary fidelity scores tend to have not just the monthly or the regular meetings between VR staff and IPS agency staff. They typically also have what they call a quarterly meeting where the supervisory level staff from VR and IPS agencies are invited.
Oh, nice.
And that quarterly call or meeting, what it can really do is kind of raise the profile of some kind of everyday challenges that might be happening with decision makers in the room. You can talk that through with decision makers in the room, and set your watch to it. There will always be a disagreement about something, but it doesn't mean that people have to be upset with each other. Oftentimes, it's less of a matter of we can't do it or can we do it, and it's more of a matter of how we do it that really gets the problem solved, if that makes any sense. It's a change in perspective. Often, too, if you have the leadership at the agencies talking with each other, that enhances the relationship over time, too, when leadership is talking to each other. And I have seen many, many times where, the employment specialists and the VR counselors are raising the flag and saying, we've got a real problem, this is happening and we don't know what to do. The leadership, they're exactly the right people to try to help solve it, especially if it has to do with guidelines or regulations, because they're the ones that can kind of have that final interpretation of a regulation that maybe an employment specialist can't, Right. So it's important to get them on board and get their buy-in at the front end.
Yep, absolutely, I agree. One of the other things, and I was at a training here recently where we talked about the fact that if there are disagreements, sometimes the supervisor or leadership talking with whoever the disagreement's with has more teeth than perhaps the direct service person. We all want to collaborate well with each other. I think we all want to have as pleasant a time doing that and effective a time doing that, but sometimes it doesn't go that way. So sometimes the teeth,
right,
if you will, come in. So, that was one of the conversations we had too, is a supervisor has more teeth than does a direct service staff. So they need our help on occasion.
Right.
Anybody who has a question or a comment can either type in the chat box or they can raise their hand. If you see where the hand, little hand icon is, if you click on the area where it says attendees, and it will open up the list of attendees, and you can raise your hand within that as well in order to be able to ask a question. We have a quiet group today. Now, see, my temptation is always to take my computer, go sit by a lake, and toss in a fishing line while I'm. Well, there I see it.
A good idea. On the next call, that's where I'll be, Don.
Okay, see, I did that for you. I see Andrea has a question, and I'm trying to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can.
Hi, I'm brand new, and so this might have been addressed in a previous training, but when people are in the IPS program or with foundational community supports, are they eligible for Ticket to Work?
Yes, they actually are. When we're talking about DVR, DVR is the one who is the agency or entity who gets ticket assigned to them first. But the state of Washington is working on signing the, and now of course I'm not going to remember what the terminology is, but it's an agreement that says we understand that DVR gets the first payments, and we will then sign up to do the payments after the fact. DVR, the state of Washington is working on an employment network. It's not fully functional as yet, but.
I was curious because a client in the program I'm just leaving to take this position, he was going through DVR, and then he got a letter saying that he was no longer eligible for Ticket to Work because he was enrolled in the state program. It was after he's living in a group home with the UCS program, and I think somebody changed a Medicaid waiver coupon on the back end, and then he got this letter saying he was no longer eligible. So I wasn't really sure what to do in that situation. But
lots of unknowns, it sounds like. Yeah. No, typically, Ticket is so interesting because it's the one and only source of funding that I'm aware of that allows double dipping, if you will. A ticket can be assigned while a person is receiving other services. The exception being if the ticket is open with an agency, then and if you're an employment network, the person can't have it assigned to two employment networks at the same time. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, he's thinking about enrolling with my program because he had kind of run its course with DVR. So he still has the job that they placed him in. They're just no longer working with him.
Okay.
And but he has a lot of questions and nobody's available to answer it for him. So I thought about enrolling him in order to help him through that process. And he's also thinking about a job change. But just wanted to see if he's eligible to continue that.
Is the agency that you're working for an employment network?
Not that I know of. We just started this program, and it's all very new to me and my bosses.
Okay. One of the things about Ticket to Work is in order to, for an agency to accept payment, you've got to be an employment network.
Oh, I'm sure we're not.
Right.
I'm sure we're not that.
Yeah. And so if he assigns his ticket to someone else, what he's saying is, I'm going to work with you, this other employment network. And so then there would be two potentially agencies doing the same thing for the person. So that would have to be something that you would work out.
So we should figure out which agency got the ticket. And I don't think he understands any of that, and he wasn't able to tell me.
Okay. So it sounds you're thinking his ticket has been assigned to someone?
I think so, because this letter basically said we're going to close you with us because someone in the state of Washington is working with you, but it didn't really say who.
Okay. Andrea, reach out to me after this. I might be able to get my colleague to look up to see if there's a ticket assigned, and maybe help you out with this process. But check with me afterwards if you would, please.
Thanks.
Are there other, here I see a question. Let's see. All right, looks like Holly has a question. Holly, I'm going to try and unmute you. It looks like you're unmuted. Did you have a question you wanted to ask verbally, or did you want to type it into the chat box? Are you still there, Holly? All right. Well, Holly, from this end, I've got you unmuted. It may also be that you're muted from your end. So if you wanted to ask a question, it looks like you're on the internet too, so it would have to be using your computer's microphone. Feel free, if you're not able to do that, in order to just type the information into your the chat box. That will work as well. Does anyone else have? Or Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add to the whole Ticket to Work Employment Network conversation?
No, I mean, as you were talking, it's not dissimilar to the way other states have implemented those things. And I know you kind of said the naughty double dipping, but there is that part of it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting scenario.
I don't know if it's right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but they allow it. So whatever.
Yeah, very odd. It feels very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So does anyone else have questions, comments, things to add? If there's someone else that's a greater expert than I am related to Ticket to Work and employment networks, please feel free to hop on and give some additional information. Okay. So I guess another question that I would ask, and it's not actually related to your content, Paul, are folks getting connected with each other as we do these things? Are supervisors ending up having, side conversations, or do you recognize names on the list, and are you getting connected in order to be able to kind of start developing that relationship outside of these sessions? I do recognize several of the names on the list, and so I'm hoping, in fact, that's happening because that's part of the intent. I would mention. Oops,
hey, Dawn.
Yes.
Oh, hey, Dawn. This is Paul. I was gonna put out there that if it's kind of related to your question. If supervisors are getting connected and they're kind of talking to each other to understand all of this and see how it works on the ground, if in those conversations questions come up that we can answer on these calls and they want to email them to you in advance of a call, I am very comfortable with that. It doesn't have to be related to the content of any sort of presentation that we put together. But if there are calls that people don't want to ask because they feel like they're out of left field, I'm comfortable with them asking.
Okay, and that's a great reminder. Let's see. It looks like Natalie has a question. I'm going to try and unmute you, Natalie. Oh, it says you are self-muted also. So I've clicked on it to hopefully unmute from my end. So if you unmute from your end too, you can either ask the question verbally or you can put it in the chat box. And that was Natalie. Still says self-muted. All right. This whole muting and unmuting thing ends up being kind of the bane of our existence, doesn't it? In regards to having the question and answer. Going back up to Holly, it looks like she actually had a question that said, attendee can't be unmuted until they enter their PIN. Click to send the PIN, and I wasn't aware that we had one. So something is not right with the system related to that. Natalie, it looked like for one brief second you were unmuted from your end too. Did you want to give it a try again? Okay. Alrighty. I very much agree with Paul's statement that if you have questions in between time that you want to shoot to one or the other of us. I know Paul typically has his contact information somewhere, and I, send mine out with the notices when I send out training notices. Do please feel free to reach out to us with questions. What I'm thinking I might do with this particular time is something a little different than what I've done. I always send out a thank you for having been here, along with the slides and the recording. I'm also going to do just a brief paragraph in regards to what we discussed, and have people send questions back related to that. So I'm going to do something at least slightly different this time. It looks like we're up against our time. It's 3:01. So thank you all for attending the webinar today. Be looking for that thank you email and the information that I'm going to send out with it. Please do feel free to come to the next one, which will be hosted by Rutgers University. It will be on July 8th, same time. I don't know what the topic is as yet, but we'll be sending that out shortly. Wanted to mention too, we're doing something slightly different. We have a distribution list and have had to kind of send these out by hand, if you will. And we are switching over to Gov Delivery, which is a distribution list at the Washington state level, which will generate, if we send the training announcement to them, it will broadcast it out to everybody at the same time without us getting 60 different auto responses and bad email addresses and things like that. So I personally am looking very forward to it, but make sure that if you have some kind of system in your email that causes things to be bounced back, that as we get out the information, you get it into your email system to allow it to come through. Thank you so very much. Enjoy your day and the sun, and we'll talk to you in a month. Bye-bye. Thanks, Paul.
Have a good day, Dawn. Bye.
You too.
Bye.